Less than a month ago, a remarkable series of events happened in Guatemala, a country just south of Mexico. On September 1st, the Guatemalan Congress was set to vote on whether to strip the country's president, Otto Pérez Molina, of his immunity so he could be tried for corruption. That day, in an attempt to delay proceedings and prevent Congress from voting, a group of sympathizers of the president blocked the entrances of the chamber. Protesters fighting against corruption that had been on the street for weeks soon arrived. Tensions escalated as members began to arrive, but the protesters, armed with white flowers, formed a human chain to allow the members to reach the door. As the rain began to pour, demonstrators shielded the police that were surrounding the building with plastic tarps. The intimidation failed, and the vote was allowed to proceed. The verdict was unanimous. The next day, a Guatemalan judge issued an arrest order, and that evening, President Molina submitted his resignation to Congress. Within 24 hours, he was sitting in front of a judge in connection to a multi-million-dollar corruption scandal that had already landed his vice president in jail and taken down much of his government. Pérez Molina is now in jail, and he is due to stand trial in December. When I first began working on corruption, organized crime, and citizen security in Central America, this moment seemed like an unrealistic dream. You see, corruption in Guatemala is endemic. It permeates society, politics, and every institution of government. Corruption has allowed criminal groups to infiltrate and co-opt the state institutions in order to ensure impunity for their crimes. And this has hindered the state's ability to provide even basic services, leaving the country mired in poverty, violence, and injustice. Guatemala is considered a middle-income country, and yet over half of its population lives in poverty and 13% in extreme poverty. More than 40% of kids under the age of 5 suffer from chronic malnutrition, the 4th highest rate in the world. And although its brutal civil war ended in 1996, Guatemala today is considered one of the most dangerous countries in the world. Its people live with the 2nd highest rate of child murdered and 3rd highest of women killings worldwide. On average, 16 people are brutally killed in Guatemala every day. And just to put that into perspective, if the United States had the homicide rate of Guatemala, about 321 people would be killed on a daily basis in this country. Victims of violence often find no protection from the authorities. In fact, many of them are as scared of the police as they are of the criminals. And given that the institutions are so weak, many cases are never investigated, let alone prosecuted. So in a country with such high levels of corruption and weak institutions, how did the president, the most powerful man in the country, who enjoyed immunity, fall from office and end up before a judge in a matter of months? Guatemala does not have a culture of political activism, mainly due to years of state repression during the war. But since April of this year, Guatemalans have found the courage to take to the streets and demand an end to corruption and impunity. Week after week, for the last 5 months, thousands of Guatemalans have poured into the streets to demand justice and an end to impunity. And these protests have been larger than Guatemalans have seen in recent history. They have brought together people from all walks of life, different socioeconomic, political, and class lines. But what has been most impressive about these protests is that they have been peaceful and that they have been organized through the use of social media. So why did Guatemalans decide to rise up? Well, their public outcry was motivated by the results of an unusual and groundbreaking experiment to combat corruption and organized crime, an experiment that is little known outside of the country, the International Commission Against Impunity in Guatemala, or CICIG. CICIG was created in 2007. It was a proposal that originated by a group of Guatemalan human rights activists that were very concerned about how deeply organized crime had infiltrated the state institutions and how incapable the state was of combating the problem on its own. And so they sought outside help. And the road to create the CICIG was not an easy one, but after nearly 6 years, with the support of the United Nations and at the request of the government, Guatemala made history by establishing this new, first of its kind, international investigatory body. CICIG's innovation lies in its use of partnership, a partnership between local justice and security institutions and this international agency to fight corruption and organized crime. You see, CICIG has the ability to carry out its own independent investigations, but unlike other international mechanisms, it has to work with the country's attorney general, using Guatemalan law and Guatemalan courts. This is unique and very powerful. CICIG is not there to temporarily replace institutions, but to work with them in order to build local capacity. Now, as you can imagine, having to work with the institutions that the Commission is seeking to reform has not always resulted in the perfect marriage. But I do believe that this partnership is its greatest strength. For Guatemalans to see their president sitting before a judge in a Guatemalan courtroom, they know that change is real, and that they have a chance to make that change permanent. In its nearly 8 years of operation in the country, CICIG has carried out over 200 criminal investigations involving more than 30 criminal structures and hundreds of government officials. Its impressive track record includes the conviction of a former president, ministers, police chiefs, politicians, businessmen, retired generals, and drug traffickers. CICIG has changed the way Guatemalans carry out criminal investigations and improved its fragile legal system. It has promoted reforms and introduced modern crime-fighting techniques, including a special unit to carry out legal wiretaps, an improved witness protection program, and special courts in the capital that are better able to protect judges from organized crime. But CICIG has also created an environment where courageous and committed Guatemalans are finally able to use their institutions to serve the people and not the corrupt. A former attorney general told me lately that she was amazed at the beginning of her tenure to find prosecutors that were eager to do their work, but scared to do so out of fear of reprisal from those above. That same attorney general perhaps captures best the spirit that is transforming Guatemala today when she said that the promise of genuine justice does not allow for privileges. And that promise is what's finally being realized in Guatemala today. CICIG has shown Guatemalans, but people all over the region and across the world, that justice can function even against those that were once deemed untouchable, that you can have a justice system where no one, not even a president, is above the law. Now, as someone who has worked on human rights and corruption for many years, these are the type of transformational moments that we spend our entire lives working towards. And I know many challenges remain in Guatemala, but what they have been able to achieve with the support of CICIG is a triumph for hope and a roadmap of what might be possible in other countries. But this is also an important story from other perspectives. Many of us recall the thousands of children that arrived at the US southern border last summer. We saw the images and the headlines of the overcrowded shelter and protection facilities, and the debate that all these stories sparked here in Washington. Many of these kids were actually coming from Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. What we didn't hear much about was the violence, insecurity, and poverty that was driving many of these kids to take the harrowing journey. They were not leaving their homes voluntarily. They were abandoning their homes and community in search of security from criminal violence. And many of them knew the risk that they were taking. They knew the risk of kidnapping, of rape, and of death. But for them, they preferred to take that journey and know that at least they had a chance. Because you see, in societies with endemic corruption, people have nowhere to turn. Justice and police institutions are there to protect the interest of criminal organizations, and not yours and your families. And it is in tackling this corruption and strengthening the rule of law while making it more accountable to ordinary citizens that you take a first step at building secure societies. CICIG has paved the way to achieve this, not just in Guatemala, but beyond. I am all too familiar with the consequences of corruption. As a 13-year-old girl in Colombia, my father disappeared. Shortly after, those considered responsible came after everything we had. Through bribery and connections and coercion, they manipulated land records, forged certificates, and bought off countless number of judges and police. This was my first encounter with our justice system, and a wake-up call to the corrosive impact of corruption. But I do believe that corruption is best fought by strengthening the rule of law and not by losing all hope in it. Guatemala has shown the world that justice and the rule of law can prevail, and that corruption and organized crime are not insurmountable. Their experiment at tackling corruption and organized crime can serve as a model for other countries that are tackling high levels of criminal violence and weak and corrupt institutions. Guatemala was once a place many people ignored, but today it is an innovator, and it is inspiring reformers in other countries. Already, activists in Mexico, El Salvador, and Honduras are calling for their own version of a CICIG. And with our help and international support, what started as an unlikely experiment at fighting corruption can lead a sea change for fighting impunity and setting new standards for accountability, not just in Central America, but beyond. Thank you.